Professor Andres Kasekamp, who is professor of the Department of Political Sciences of the University of Tartu and also author of History of the Baltic States, published by Holger Macmillan.
Thank you, Anna. I was fascinated to listen to Dr. Borg's presentation because a lot of those themes are the ones that I enjoy talking about a lot as well, and I think he set the broader context very well. And I'm also going to try to contextualize the question of the national minorities and the Jewish minority in Estonia, and looking at it wider in the Baltic case. Now, first of all, if we need to know something about Baltic history, I would say perhaps the one key fact that we should begin with is the importance of the German elite throughout history until the 20th century. That's a defining feature which definitely separates Estonia and Latvia on the one hand from Lithuania. No matter were they the Danes, the Poles, the Swedes, Germans or Russians who were in control of these territories, it was from the moment of the Northern Crusades in the 13th century right until the Russian Revolution of 1917 that the Baltic German elite, the landowners in the countryside and the merchants in the cities, were the dominant political, social, cultural force which enjoyed broad self-government. And that's a defining feature of Estonian society, Latvian society, but Lithuania, as you know, is quite different. The Lithuanians were those who, the last pagans in Europe, those who managed to resist the onslaught of the Teutonic Knights, of the Germanic Crusaders in the 13th century, and established their own state and expanded further eastwards into what is today Belarus and Ukraine, but entered a dynastic union with Poland, and throughout the centuries, in the early modern period, became more and more dominated by Polish influence. And of course, the history of the Jewish communities in the Baltic Sea region is much more connected with Lithuania than it is with, as we heard already, Estonia, because of the Pale of Settlement in the Tsarist era, more or less corresponding to what was the Lithuanian-Polish Commonwealth, or Rzeczpospolita, which didn't stretch up as far as Estland and Livland, the three Baltic provinces that Thomas showed us on the map, Estland, Livland and Courland. Courland, which was included in the Pale of Settlement, which is the southwestern part of Latvia today. So that's perhaps the broadest outlines, the differences between the three Baltic states. And Baltic, of course, is a term which really comes about in the 20th century. It's not something that's used earlier as a marker of identification by Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians themselves. 100 years ago, if you've been talking about a Balt, it would have been a German in Estland, Livland or Courland who was using this as a marker of self-identification within the Baltic provinces of the Russian Empire. And it's only with the establishment of these independent states after the First World War that the term Baltic begins to apply to the Estonians and Latvians, and perhaps a bit more reluctantly to the Lithuanians. Now, turning to the minorities in these three countries, and of course we'll talk more about Estonia than Latvia or Lithuania. So could you put the slide with the figures? Dr. Vago already mentioned some of the figures in the Estonian case, but here again you'll see the influence of the historic patterns, how Lithuania dramatically differs from Estonia and Latvia. In the Estonian case, of course, in the Latvian case, it's the Russian minority which is by far the largest, and it's in Lithuania where the Jewish minority is in first place, whereas in Estonia it's a rather marginal phenomenon of only 0.4% of the population, just over 4,000 as you recall, the population of Estonia at the time was just over 1 million. The Russians, numerically, were the largest group, but in terms of their importance and significance, were certainly not. It was, of course, the Baltic Germans, even though they were no longer the ruling elite after independence, who still maintained a greater deal of influence, who were still the best educated ethnic group in Estonia and Latvia, who were the wealthiest, certainly, who were the best organized politically. For instance, if we look at representation in the parliaments during the democratic period, which ran until 1934, then the Baltic Germans always managed to achieve the maximum representation possible relative to their size in the population in the parliament. Whereas the Russians were always the opposite. They were the least successful at that, which is greatly a function of the fact that they were a less educated, a poorer and more peripheral part of Estonian and Latvian society, mostly being poor farmers and fishermen on the eastern periphery of both of those countries, with the exception, of course, of some refugees from Russia proper during in the aftermath of the Russian Civil War. But the Russian community is really the opposite. And the Jewish community is in its structure, you could say, a bit more similar to the German. More urban, more educated, better off than they are to the Russians. The Poles were, in the Estonian case, completely insignificant, but again, important in the Latvian and Lithuanian cases. Here I've missed one group which was already mentioned, more significant in the Estonian case, were the Swedes, the coastal Swedes, who formed 0.7% of the population. Now, what rights were guaranteed to these minorities and how were they treated in the independent republics? All of them, in their declarations of independence and their constitutions, guaranteed equality for all, regardless of ethnic or religious background. All three of them were forced, not really wanting to, but were, as a condition of becoming members of the League of Nations, the predecessor to the United Nations, to take on board or to ratify the League of Nations conventions on protection of national minorities, something which the old European states didn't have to do. But Estonia went further. As you know, it's been mentioned here several times already, and there's the display outside on cultural autonomy, which was indeed unique. And to answer Professor Laur's question, or the title of our seminar, it does make Estonia rather exceptional. The idea wasn't originally an Estonian idea, cultural autonomy. It was two Austrian Marxists, Otto Bauer and Karl Renner, who came up with the idea, and the original idea was meant to be implemented for the Habsburg Empire, which obviously never got a chance to try those or test those ideas there. But the innovativeness of this cultural autonomy, it's not just the fact that Estonia granted a cultural autonomy, but what makes this more interesting in a more general sense is that it was a new form of autonomy. It wasn't a territorial autonomy, and thus it was very well designed specifically for the German and Jewish community in Estonia, because it was an autonomy delinked or unconnected to territory. Other previous solutions or ideas in Europe would be linked to where a national minority happens to be living. They live in some corner or compact province of the country, and you could consider that area or district getting a special autonomy. But in this case, with the composition or the structure of the German communities and the Jewish community in Estonia, that really wasn't possible. They were spread throughout the countries and mostly in urban areas. So the idea of territorial autonomy was obviously a non-starter. So thus this innovative Austrian Marxist idea of autonomy which is centered on the individual. And this cultural autonomy law, which was finally passed in 1925 in Estonia, was also voluntary in nature, which of course was important, that citizens could declare themselves of this ethnicity or nationality and register to belong to the Cultural Council, which was set up to govern this cultural autonomy, which then dealt with mainly issues of education and had the power to raise additional taxes from its members. And the background to this, of course, are, again, the Germans, the key factor here. The Cultural Autonomy Bill, as it was presented in the Estonian Parliament, was drafted by Werner Hasselblatt, a Baltic German deputy in the Estonian Parliament, and he had very much the interests of his community in mind, because as Dr. Wagner was saying, that the Baltic German community, the land reforms, the land redistribution, hit them hardest. They felt to be the victims of that. So before the Second World War, it was really, the minority questions were really, in the Baltic context, all about the Germans. Today, when you say minorities in Estonia, or Latvia, or Lithuania, the Baltic states, everyone thinks, of course, it's the question of the Russians. But before the Second World War, minorities, we were always talking about a German question for at least Estonia. Lithuania, as you can see the percentages, it's obviously quite different. And the Germans so designed this with their own community in mind, and the Estonian politicians had several years of debate in the Estonian parliament before they finally came along to this. It's often claimed that perhaps the final catalyst for getting the law passed, because the opponents of this were often argued that this would be creating some sort of state within a state, and thus potentially disloyal to the government. But the final catalyst was the 1924 attempted communist putsch, which was sponsored by the Communist International, and that sort of sense of threat and the need for unity and solidarity within the countries, which finally convinced perhaps the most, say, nationalist-minded Estonian politicians to also go along with the cultural autonomy bill. And as I said, it was designed also with the Germans in mind, but it had a minimum of who qualified to apply for the cultural autonomy law, and that was set at a community of 3,000, which, recall that the Jewish community was just over 4,000. So it was particularly with that community in mind that it would have that opportunity. And it was, as I said, only the Germans and the Jews who took this opportunity up. The Russians and the Swedes, who were a larger group than the Jews, never did. And there's very logical explanations for this, because of the nature of the structure of those communities. In that, as I described, the Germans and the Jews were more urban, better educated, better organized, greater financial resources. Then the Russians lived along the eastern periphery. The Swedes lived on the opposite end of the country. As you can imagine, the areas closest to Sweden, the coastal areas and the islands, where they also formed very compact communities. So they could basically govern their own daily affairs through control of the local self-government in their own democratically elected districts. So they had no need for this separate cultural council, because of basically the demographics or the geographical location of where they were. And the Russians, were, as I said, a bit more poorly organized and disunited amongst themselves compared to the Germans and the Jews in this case. The Germans were also noteworthy in taking the cause of national minorities to the wider international audience. The Germans complained a lot about Estonia and Latvia. They petitioned the League of Nations in the 20s that the Estonians and Latvians are discriminating against them because of the land reform. The League of Nations rejected this claim, saying that the land reform was about social equality, or doing away with inequality and injustices, historical injustices. And indeed, one can claim that Estonia and Latvia were, after the land reforms, were amongst the most egalitarian societies in Europe after the reform, in terms of land distribution and wealth. But the Baltic Germans were the main losers in this case, and thus they had the biggest grievances, and having been the privileged elite, had a more difficult time coming to terms with the independence of these republics. And in fact, Vernon Hasselblad, who was the author of the cultural autonomy law, later on in the days of the Third Reich, wasn't a shining example of a humanist as he was in the 1920s in the independent Republic of Estonia. Now, Dr. Vag also addressed the question of authoritarianism in the 1930s, or in the case of Estonia and Latvia, that starts from 1934. In the case of Lithuania, it starts only in 1926. And indeed, there is some regression in terms of the opportunities or treatment of the national minorities in the three countries. But in principle, the general outlines, like cultural autonomy, remain in place. And it often seems paradoxical, but I think it was also mentioned actually by Professor Levin earlier when he was talking about the Latvian dictator Karlis Ulmanis, that the minorities, and in particular the Jewish minority, knew that the three authoritarian rulers were probably more, say, sympathetic or friendly to the minorities in general than were many of the sort of mainstream democratic parties which they had outlawed. Because, as I said earlier in the beginning, for many the minority question was the privileged Baltic Germans and doing away with their position in society, because very much of the policies of these authoritarian regimes in the 30s were about Estonianizing or Latvianizing or Lithuanianizing the society, which meant minimizing the influence which had been predominant so far of German, or to a lesser degree of Russian within society, and then promoting a native new elite, as was said earlier in the case of Tartu University also, which had started out as a German-speaking university, and in the 1920s was still a mixed German, Russian, Estonian, and with, in the 1930s, a new sort of generation, first generation of Estonian scholars and professors teaching in the native language. And at this point, I shall have to stop. It's punishment for not being perhaps the moderator in the first panel able to keep track of time. So, give the floor back to the moderator.
Thank you very much.